had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. I needed time alone, away from the city, from the constant noise, the endless emails, the people who never stopped asking for something. I had found a cabin listed online, a small, rustic place in the middle of a forested area about 4 hours from the nearest town. It was far enough that I would be completely isolated, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, checking and double-checking my list. I had enough food for a week, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small camping stove, blankets, and a journal. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I didn't expect much signal out there. The drive itself was long and uneventful, the road winding through thick forests and empty stretches where no other cars passed for miles. The GPS guided me down a series of dirt roads that became progressively narrower and rougher, until I was driving on what was little more than a path, barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching over the road, and I remember feeling a strange sense of anticipation mixed with unease. There was something about that isolation that was exhilarating but also slightly terrifying. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was small, made of weathered wood, with a sloping roof and a small porch. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the door, and smoke curled faintly from the chimney, suggesting someone had been there recently, or that the previous occupant had left it prepared for the next visitor. I parked the car and unloaded my things, noting the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was a heavy, thick silence, the kind that made every creak of wood or rustle of leaves stand out. The cabin was simple, a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a basic kitchen, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft that served as a bedroom. The walls were bare, except for a few shelves holding some old books and jars. The windows had no curtains, and the glass was slightly warped, making the forest outside look distorted. I set down my bags and walked around, taking in every detail, as though memorizing the cabin itself might make me feel safer. That night, I lit a fire in the stove. The flames threw long shadows across the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes and making the cabin creak. I made a simple dinner, eating quietly while listening to the forest. Everything seemed normal except for a faint feeling of being watched. I dismissed it. I was alone and I knew it. It was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. I went to bed early, the blankets pulled up around me, and soon drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to a strange sound. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on gravel, but slow and irregular. I froze, listening. There was nothing in the cabin. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was probably an animal, or maybe the wind outside. I tried to shake off the unease and went about my day, exploring the surrounding area. The forest was dense, with towering trees and a thick layer of leaves on the ground. The path that led to the cabin was almost invisible, overgrown and narrow. Birds moved in the treetops, and occasionally I caught sight of a deer or rabbit. It was beautiful, but every rustle in the underbrush made my heart skip a beat. That night, the unease returned. I had prepared for noises, after all, it was the wilderness, but these were different. There was a series of sounds, subtle at first, like someone walking softly around the perimeter of the cabin. Then, a thud, a deliberate, heavy thump, as if something had struck the door frame from outside. I didn't open the door. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window, sweeping the beam across the trees, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shapes, just the dark forest and the shadows of the trees. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone, or something, just beyond the tree line, watching me. The wind gusted and rattled the cabin, and I could swear I heard footsteps moving on the porch. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I decided I would go into town the next day. I needed to feel normal again, to know I wasn't imagining things. The following day, I packed a backpack with essentials, ready for a hike to the nearby main road that connected to the town. As I stepped outside, the forest was silent. Too silent. The birds were gone, the animals gone, the wind barely moving. I walked along the path, keeping my eyes open, aware of every sound, every shadow. That's when I saw the first sign that something was very wrong. The firewood pile had been moved. Not far, but enough that it was obvious someone had been there. I hadn't touched it since the first night. Panic began to rise. I scanned the forest, shining my flashlight in every direction, though it was still daylight. There was no one, no figure, no sign of movement except for the disturbed leaves. My heart pounded. I knew then that I wasn't alone, and that whoever or whatever was out there had been watching me. I debated running back to the cabin or continuing toward the road. I chose to continue toward the road, telling myself that leaving the area quickly was the best option. As I walked, I noticed more signs. Footprints in the dirt, broken branches, and flattened grass. The footprints weren't human, they were larger, and their shape was strange, almost like a cross between a boot and something else. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a large animal. Maybe it had a strange shape because of the mud. But I couldn't ignore the way the forest seemed to close in around me, as though it were intentionally guiding me back to the cabin. The sun began to set. Shadows lengthened and merged together. I had to stop and rest, though fear made it impossible to sit down. I crouched behind a large tree and looked back toward the cabin. That's when I saw movement. A figure, or something resembling a figure, was standing at the edge of the clearing near the cabin. It didn't move like a human. Its stance was wrong, awkward, and it seemed too large for a person. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, but I knew I had been observed from the moment I arrived. I decided not to go back. My only option was to keep moving. I walked faster, almost running, stumbling over roots and rocks. The path twisted and turned, sometimes leading me deeper into the forest, sometimes opening to small clearings where I could see nothing but trees. Every now and then, I thought I heard running behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. The feeling of being hunted, though, never left. Night fell completely. I had no flashlight, only the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. I realized that if I didn't find the road soon, I would be trapped in the forest. I remembered seeing a small creek on the map that led toward the road. Following water was usually a good way to navigate. I found it after what felt like hours. The sound of the creek was comforting, though it didn't erase the fear. I moved alongside it, trying to stay quiet, trying to make as little noise as possible. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The forest seemed endless. My energy was gone. My legs burned, and I was wet and cold from crossing the creek in places where I had to step into water. That's when I made a mistake. I slipped on a wet rock, fell hard, and twisted my ankle. Pain shot through it, sharp and immediate. I couldn't walk properly. Panic surged. I tried to drag myself along the ground, using my hands to pull myself toward the direction of the road, but every movement was slow and exhausting. I began to consider that I might have to spend the night in the forest. That was when I heard a sound that made me freeze. A low, guttural growl, close, very close. My heart raced, terror gripping me like ice. I knew it wasn't a bear. It was too deliberate, too targeted. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I stayed still, holding my breath, hoping that it would go away. The growl continued, circling, echoing through the trees. It was tracking me, I realized, watching me through the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel its presence surrounding me. I remembered the emergency whistle I had packed. I took it out and blew it as hard as I could. The sound carried, piercing the stillness of the forest. Immediately, the growl stopped. Silence. Then, in the distance, I heard voices, human voices. Couldn't believe it. I crawled toward the sound, dragging my injured ankle over rocks and mud. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the trees onto the road. A car was parked there, lights on, and two men were standing outside, looking at me in shock. I collapsed on the ground, exhausted, shaking, and barely able to speak. They helped me into the car, wrapping my ankle and giving me water. I told them everything, though it sounded insane. They didn't question me too much. They said the forest could be dangerous, and people sometimes got trapped or stalked by wild animals. But as they drove me back to the town, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the strange figure, and the way I had been watched. The police later investigated the cabin. There was no one there. No tracks, no signs of anyone else entering recently. Nothing to explain what I had seen or heard. They suggested it might have been a wild animal, maybe something injured or territorial. I never went back. I left the cabin on the listings, warning others never to go there alone. I told myself it was luck, survival instinct, and maybe some misperception. But every time I close my eyes, I remember the feeling of being watched in that forest, the growl circling me in the dark, and the way the forest seemed alive with intent. I survived, and that's what matters. I learned to respect isolation, to never underestimate the wilderness, and to always trust that instinct that tells you when you are not alone. I moved on with my life, but I carry that memory with me. It's not a memory of ghosts or monsters. It's a memory of fear, real fear, the kind that comes from knowing you are vulnerable, alone, and being hunted by something you cannot control. That cabin and that forest reminded me that the world is bigger than we understand, and sometimes survival is all about listening, watching, and moving when you think every option is gone. I had been planning this trip for months, searching online for the perfect isolated cabin where I could escape from everything. Work, the city, the constant noise and people, it all felt suffocating. I wanted silence, solitude, and a place where I could disappear for a while. Finally, I found it. A small wooden cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, far from anyone else. The pictures online made it look cozy, with a stone fireplace, a small porch, and a view of a frozen lake through the trees. The cabin's owner promised total privacy, and I bought the reservation immediately. I drove for hours, through winding country roads that became smaller and narrower, until finally I reached the last dirt road that would take me into the woods. My car rattled over potholes and loose rocks, and the air smelled different here, earthy and cold, a sharp contrast to the city. The cabin came into view late in the afternoon. It was exactly like the photos, though smaller than I expected. The wooden walls were weathered, the windows dusty, and the roof had a few shingles missing. There was a stack of firewood near the porch, and the lake shimmered faintly through the thick trees. I parked and got out, letting the cold air hit me. The forest was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No cars, no planes, just the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I carried my bag inside and immediately felt the isolation settle over me. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, but it was not unpleasant. I unpacked quickly, organizing my things, and decided to light a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry enough, and soon the room was filled with warmth and the smell of burning pine. Outside, the sun was starting to set, and the forest began to darken. Shadows stretched between the trees, and I realized I could barely see the lake anymore. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind. It was stronger than I expected, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls and through the trees. At some point, I heard a faint noise outside. I assumed it was the wind moving branches or small animals rustling through the leaves. I was alone, and yet, despite my logical mind, the sound made my stomach tighten. The sound continued intermittently, a scraping or thumping noise, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I tried to sleep, but every small noise felt magnified in the quiet. The next morning, I woke to a frozen landscape. Snow had fallen overnight, covering the ground in a thick, muffled blanket. The lake was partially frozen, its surface reflecting the pale sunlight. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would help me shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. The forest was dense, with bare trees stretching upward like skeletal hands. As I walked, I noticed footprints in the snow that were not mine. They were deep and heavy, spaced as if something large had walked here in the night. My heart rate quickened. I followed them a short distance but realized they led away from the cabin and toward denser woods. I felt a mix of curiosity and dread. There was no one for miles, and I knew how easy it would be for someone or something to get lost in this forest. I returned to the cabin quickly, deciding it was best to stay close. Inside, I checked all the locks and windows. Everything seemed fine. I tried to distract myself, reading a book and writing in my journal. The hours passed slowly. The silence outside pressed against the cabin walls. Around midday, I heard something that made me freeze. It was deliberate. A series of knocks, slow and measured, coming from the porch. My breath caught. I thought about ignoring it, convincing myself it could be a branch knocking against the wood. But the pattern was too deliberate. Knocks. Pause. Knocks. I stayed still, listening, and after a few moments it stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but the forest went back to its normal, oppressive silence. I spent the rest of the day checking the cabin and preparing for night. I stacked firewood inside, made sure I had enough food and water, and reinforced the windows as best I could. Still, as night approached, my anxiety grew. I was alone in the middle of the woods, far from help. I had my phone, but the signal was weak, barely enough to send a text or check the time. My mind kept returning to the knocks. Whoever or whatever had made them was close. The night was the worst. Every small sound sent me heart racing. Branches scraping, the occasional thump in the snow outside, and something heavier moving slowly. At one point, I saw a shadow pass by the window. I froze, staring at it. My mind raced, imagining all the possibilities. I felt trapped, knowing that if someone wanted to harm me, I had no one to call immediately. I decided to stay in the living room near the fireplace, keeping a fire going for light and warmth, and keeping a heavy stick nearby. Hours passed. Every sound seemed to come closer, and I realized that I could not relax until morning. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to look outside. The snow had changed. There were new tracks around the cabin, heavy boot prints leading from the trees to the porch. My stomach twisted. I had no idea who could have come so close without me noticing, but there were no footprints leading back into the forest. Whoever it was, they had left and disappeared. My mind refused to accept that it was random. I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to explore cautiously. I walked carefully, looking for signs of anyone nearby. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found a patch of disturbed snow. It looked like someone had been lying there watching the cabin. I felt the panic building. This was no longer a story about isolation, it was real danger. I returned inside and realized I needed a plan. I could not stay and wait. I packed everything essential: food, water, a blanket, and the small first aid kit, and kept the stick close. By midday, I left the cabin. I chose a path I hoped would lead back to the main road. The forest was thick, but I forced myself to stay calm and focused. I avoided paths that looked like they led to other hidden areas where someone could be waiting. The snow made my progress slow, and my feet grew cold and sore. I could not stop thinking about what had happened in the cabin. Whoever it was had been close enough to watch me, close enough to reach me without me noticing. Several hours into my walk, I saw the faint outline of a road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I remained cautious, knowing that the forest could still hide someone. As I reached the road, I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically and it slowed. The driver stopped and asked if I needed help. I explained as best I could, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. The driver called the authorities, and I waited with them, shivering from exhaustion and fear. The police arrived and took statements. They searched the area around the cabin but found no one. The tracks near the cabin had vanished, as if the person had melted into the forest. They assured me that this sometimes happened in remote areas, but their reassurance did little to calm me. I realized I had narrowly escaped something serious, and the isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt like a trap I had been lucky to escape. Eventually, I returned home. The cabin rental was canceled, and I swore I would never go back to that part of the woods. The memory of the snow, the tracks, the knocks at the door, and the shadow outside the window stayed with me for months. I learned to respect the quiet of isolation, understanding that it can hide dangers that are all too real. The experience left me more cautious, but also more aware of how fragile safety can be when you are alone in a place so removed from the world. In time, I processed what had happened. I realized I had survived because I stayed calm enough to think logically, to watch and listen carefully, and to act decisively. It was fear, yes, but controlled fear, the kind that sharpens awareness and makes every decision deliberate. I knew that, in the same situation, someone less prepared could have been hurt or worse. That knowledge never left me. The forest, the cabin, the snow, they were beautiful and they were dangerous. They taught me a lesson I could never unlearn. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the cabin, the frozen lake, and the dark trees stretching endlessly. I can remember the sound of the wind, the knocks on the porch, and the tracks in the snow. The fear was real, and the isolation was absolute, but I survived. I returned to the world outside the woods, carrying that experience with me. A constant reminder that even in the quietest, most beautiful places, danger can lurk unseen, and the only way to survive is to remain alert, aware, and ready to act. I never went back to that cabin, and I never took solitude for granted again. The experience changed me, taught me to respect nature, the wilderness, and the unpredictability of other humans. I still hike, still travel to remote areas, but I do so with caution and preparation. The fear I felt in that cabin never completely fades, but it no longer paralyzes me. Instead, it reminds me to be careful, to watch, and to respect the thin line between safety and danger that can exist in the most isolated places on Earth. I had been driving for hours, the road winding through dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The sky was overcast, and the wind had a sharp bite to it, even through the cracked window of my old, rattling car. My plan was simple. A few days alone in a small cabin I had rented in the northern mountains. I wanted silence, isolation, and a break from the constant noise of city life. I told myself I was prepared, but as I turned onto the narrow, dirt road leading to the cabin, I began to feel an unease I couldn't explain. The road was barely wide enough for my car, overgrown on the sides with brush and tall trees that blocked most of the sky. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the tires crunched over rocks and uneven ground, making a steady rhythm that reminded me of my own heartbeat. I reached the cabin just as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind thick clouds. It was smaller than I had imagined, made of old wood, with a tin roof that had seen decades of snow. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the steps creaked under my weight. The air smelled like wet wood and earth, damp from recent rain. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, noting the eerie quiet. There were no birds, no wind in the trees, just the soft hum of distant insects and the occasional drip of water from the roof. I stepped inside and immediately felt the chill of the cabin. It was cold, even with the small stove in the corner, and I had to rub my arms to bring some warmth to my skin. The inside was simple. A small living area with a couch that had seen better days, a wooden table with scratches covering the surface, and a tiny kitchen with a few cupboards and a sink. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom at the back. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the wood floors were uneven, making each step echo slightly. I set down my bags and lit a candle I had brought, noticing the flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Shadows I knew were only caused by the flame, yet they seemed to move in ways that didn't quite match the room. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. I unpacked slowly, placing clothes in the small dresser and setting up my sleeping area. The stove required a bit of work. I had to chop some dry wood from a pile outside and arrange it carefully to get a fire going. When I finally managed to light it, the warmth was immediate and comforting. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and I sank into the couch, exhausted but content. Outside, the forest was nearly black, and I realized I couldn't see the path I had driven in on. It was just a wall of dark trees. As night fell, I noticed small sounds that I had ignored during the day. A branch snapping outside, the rustle of something moving through the leaves, the low hum of what I thought might be an animal. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sounds were too deliberate, too precise. My imagination began to run wild. I reminded myself that in the city, every noise was predictable. Cars, people, sirens. Here, the forest had its own rhythm, one I didn't understand. I made sure the doors were locked, though I felt a strange, unnecessary tension as I did it. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. Every small noise made me tense, and the candle flickered in the corner, casting shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. I kept checking the windows, convinced I saw shapes moving in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, dreams filled with running through the woods, always chased, never catching up. Morning brought a dull light through the thin curtains. The world outside was gray and wet, the forest dripping with rain that had fallen overnight. I stepped outside to stretch and immediately noticed how isolated I truly was. The dirt road I had come on disappeared behind the thick trees, and there was no sign of another human. Not a house, not a car, nothing. The air was sharp, cold, and smelled of damp pine. I went to gather more wood for the stove and noticed footprints near the cabin. Not my own, they were smaller, and they ended abruptly at the edge of the tree line. I froze, heart hammering, trying to rationalize. Animals? Maybe, though the prints looked more like boots than paws. Couldn't tell. I brushed it off and went back inside, the feeling of unease growing heavier. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a small trail that led downhill toward what I assumed was a stream. The forest was thick, branches scraping my arms and face as I pushed through. I found the stream muddy and shallow, but clear enough to see rocks beneath the surface. I sat on a log for a long while, listening to the water and trying to calm myself. But then I heard it. A faint rustling, then a low snapping sound from deeper in the trees. I froze, straining to see through the dense forest. Something was moving, slow, deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer, but I could see nothing, and the sound didn't match any animal I knew. My stomach tightened. I decided to head back quickly, keeping my eyes and ears alert. Every step I took back felt like it was being watched. Back at the cabin, I checked the locks again and secured all the windows. I realized I hadn't thought much about what I would do if someone or something was actually around. My phone had no signal, and I had no car keys on me, having left them inside. The thought of being trapped here, isolated with no one knowing where I was, made my chest tighten with panic. I tried to distract myself by cleaning and organizing, but every creak of the wood, every small noise outside, kept me on edge. That night was worse than the first. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the porch. My heart nearly stopped. I lay there, frozen, listening. Footsteps, heavy and slow, moved across the porch. Whoever or whatever it was large. I considered screaming, but there was no one to hear me, and making noise might draw attention. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from the table and tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, every muscle tense. I waited, but nothing happened for minutes that felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the sounds moved away, fading into the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I cautiously stepped outside. The porch had scuff marks and what looked like mud smeared across the wood. Someone had been there. My stomach sank. I checked the area around the cabin. Footprints, not animal tracks, human. Big boots, made for hiking or work, leading into the trees and ending without a trail. My mind raced. Who could be out here? Why hadn't I seen anyone on the road? I had felt so safe, thinking isolation was what I wanted, but now it felt like a trap. I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, throwing things into my bag and trying to stay calm. My plan was simple. Get back to the main road, drive to town, and call someone. As I walked toward the car, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint marks along the tree trunks around the cabin, like scratches or claw marks, too high for a small animal, too jagged to be natural. My pace quickened, and I got into the car, locking the doors. The drive out was nerve-wracking. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow crossing the road, made my pulse spike. I kept the headlights on full, scanning the sides of the road. About 20 minutes in, I saw movement ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the dirt road. I slammed on the brakes. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, face obscured. My hands trembled on the wheel. For a moment, I thought it would step aside, but it didn't. I had no choice. I revved the engine and swerved slightly, narrowly missing it. The figure stepped back into the trees, disappearing, but I didn't stop. I drove faster, every nerve screaming, until finally, the dirt road opened onto a paved highway. Relief was overwhelming. I pulled over at the first gas station, hands shaking, trying to process what had happened. I realized then how dangerous my isolation had been, how vulnerable I had been in that cabin, completely alone, with no way to call for help. I reported the incident to the authorities, who said they would check the area, though there was little they could do with so few details. The cabin was abandoned after that, and I never went back. I don't remember exactly when the fear started to fade, but I do remember the relief of being back in civilization. The hum of traffic, the lights of buildings, people moving around, safe. I learned a lesson I hadn't anticipated. Isolation is only as safe as your preparation, and the forest has a silence that can hide anything. Every detail from that cabin, the footprints, the marks on the trees, the figure in the road, stays with me. I can close my eyes and see the cabin, small and silent, surrounded by endless forest, the chill of the night pressing against its walls. But now I understand it. I survived, and I carry that clarity. Fear is real, danger is real, but caution and awareness can save you. Years later, I still drive through forests, sometimes even to remote cabins, but never alone. I learned to respect isolation, to never assume safety where none exists, and to trust instincts when the silence feels too heavy. The cabin stands empty, a place where the line between solitude and danger became crystal clear to me. It's a memory I can revisit with detail, knowing exactly how I survived, and knowing that preparation, awareness, and caution turned a terrifying experience into a story with a clear ending. A story where I left alive, whole, and wiser. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After weeks of stress at work, endless phone calls, and constant pressure from deadlines, I needed to get away, to escape into silence, to be somewhere I could think without interruption. The cabin I rented was small but solid, tucked deep in a forest 2 hours from the nearest town. The road that led there was little more than a gravel path, winding through dense pines, moss-covered rocks, and thick underbrush. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. Isolation, nature, a chance to breathe and just exist for a few days. The first day was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I drove down the last stretch of road as sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything golden and soft. When I arrived, the cabin was even smaller than the picture suggested, but solid with a steep roof, wooden walls, and a single stone chimney. The forest pressed close on every side. No other buildings, no roads visible through the trees. Just the cabin and the endless green. I parked, carried my bag inside, and spent the first hour walking slowly through the rooms, familiarizing myself with the kitchen, the bathroom, the single bedroom. I unpacked, arranged my things neatly, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, looking out into the woods, listening to the wind whispering through the trees. I had brought books, a notebook, a small supply of food, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had also packed a first aid kit and a basic survival kit just in case. I wasn't planning on trouble, but there was always the chance. The cabin was old, and though it seemed sturdy, I could hear the faint creak of boards settling, the occasional snap of branches outside. I told myself that was all it was, just the forest being alive. The first night passed quietly. I made a fire in the fireplace, though the wind outside made it crackle and hiss unnervingly. The forest at night was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the call of distant animals, the soft crash of branches falling somewhere far off. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I was safe inside, that the cabin was solid. Still, I couldn't help but feel watched, though I knew rationally it was impossible. I went to bed with the flashlight beside me, just in case. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a small creek not far from the cabin, and I wanted to see it. I left the cabin mid-morning, backpack slung over my shoulder with water, a snack, and my camera. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call. As I walked, I noticed something odd. Some of the trees near the creek had marks on them, scratches that looked deliberate, almost like someone had tried to climb or claw at them. I paused, looking around, trying to see if there was a reason. Nothing, just trees, moss, and the soft babble of the creek. I shook it off and continued. The creek was beautiful. Water flowed over smooth stones, glinting in the sunlight. I sat on a rock for a while, taking pictures, listening to the water, and trying to forget the scratches I had seen. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, I noticed footprints in the mud. They were human. They weren't mine. They led along the bank of the creek and then disappeared into the trees. My stomach tightened. There was no one else supposed to be here, no other cabins for miles. I checked the time and decided I should head back quickly. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The front door was closed, but I could have sworn I had locked it. I checked anyway, retried the lock. It was secure. I tried to convince myself I must be imagining things. The forest could play tricks on your mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there while I was gone. That night, the noises outside seemed louder. Not just the normal rustle of the trees, but something else. Faint snapping of twigs, rustling in the underbrush, sometimes very close, sometimes far away. I stayed inside, doors locked, curtains drawn. I didn't sleep well. Every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked, I jumped. I kept checking the windows. Nothing. Always nothing. The next day, I tried to focus on something productive. I decided to clean the cabin, organize my things, make the place feel safe and familiar. While doing that, I heard a faint sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was different, more deliberate. Footsteps. Slow, careful. I froze. They weren't heavy, but they were definitely human. I grabbed the flashlight, turned off the lights inside, and crouched near the window. I could see nothing but trees. No one. I considered calling the police, but my phone had no signal. Panic started to rise. I told myself to stay calm. The police would be useless anyway. I was alone here. For the next few hours, I stayed inside, peering out the windows, flashlight in hand, trying to watch every movement. Nothing came. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept imagining someone standing outside the window, watching, waiting. On the third day, I knew I couldn't stay passive. I had to do something to protect myself. I gathered what I could. A large kitchen knife, a hammer, and my flashlight. I reinforced the locks on the doors and windows as best as I could. I checked the perimeter of the cabin. No footprints. No signs of anyone. Still, I didn't feel safe. I considered leaving, but I didn't know how to get down the gravel road without being seen. The forest pressed in on all sides. By late afternoon, exhaustion was catching up with me. I had been tense for days. I wanted to sleep but was too afraid. I tried to focus on small tasks. Cleaning, writing notes, organizing. That's when I noticed it. A piece of paper slipped under the door. I froze, staring at it. Carefully, I picked it up with my knife. It was blank except for a single word, written in shaky handwriting. Leave. My heart pounded. Whoever had been here wanted me gone. I looked outside. Still nothing. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. That would have been foolish. I spent the rest of the night on high alert. I sat near the window, knife in hand, listening to the forest, waiting for any sound. Hours passed. I didn't see anything. Eventually, I fell asleep in my chair, clutching the knife. When I woke, it was dawn. Everything looked calm. The morning light was soft and golden. I felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe it was over. I made coffee, slowly, carefully, trying to relax. Then I noticed it. The back door was open. Not ajar. Fully open. I could see where someone had forced it, leaving deep scratches in the wood. Panic surged. I stepped back, heart racing. My supplies, my bag. Everything was still there. Nothing stolen. Whoever had come was just watching. Just trying to scare me. I knew I had to leave immediately. I packed everything I could into my car, grabbed the knife and hammer, and started down the gravel road. Every sound, every movement made me tense. I drove slowly, peering into the trees. Nothing. Eventually, I reached a place where my phone had signal and called the police. I explained everything, showed them the cabin, the marks, the note. They took a report and sent officers to investigate. The investigation confirmed my fears. The cabin had been targeted before. Squatters, thieves, or someone living in the forest, watching cabins to scare people off. They never stole anything, but they liked to frighten people. The marks, the footsteps, the note, they had all been warnings. The officers told me I had been lucky to get out when I did. They checked the surrounding area and found a small hideout in the trees nearby. Evidence that someone had been living off and on, watching cabins in the area. I never went back to that cabin. The forest that had once seemed peaceful now felt dangerous. Knowing someone could be hiding, watching, waiting. I stayed with friends for weeks after, unable to shake the memory, replaying the sounds, the feeling of being watched. But eventually, I regained a sense of safety. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to signs others might ignore. The experience left scars, but it also left knowledge. Nature can be calm and beautiful, but humans, lurking unseen, can be far scarier than anything the forest produces naturally. Even now, when I walk in a quiet forest, I think of that cabin, the note, the footsteps in the mud, and the way the trees seem to lean in closer as if sharing a secret. I remember the fear vividly, the panic, the tension, but I also remember the careful planning that kept me alive, the calm decisions I made despite terror. I survived because I stayed alert, because I refused to ignore the signs. It was a terrifying lesson, but a clear one. The world can feel peaceful, but danger can exist just beyond sight, waiting for the right moment. And being prepared, aware, and decisive can be the difference between survival and disaster. I had been planning the trip for months, a solitary escape from the city, a place where the noise and weight of everyday life couldn't reach me. I chose a small cabin in the remote northern forests, miles away from the nearest town, because I wanted nothing but silence, isolation, and time to think. The journey there was long and tiring. My car rattled over uneven dirt roads, gravel crunching beneath the tires, the scent of wet earth filling the air. Trees pressed close to the edges of the narrow path, towering and silent, their bark slick from a recent rain. Shadows stretched in strange angles as the sun fell behind the peaks, painting the world in dull gold and dark green. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk had turned the sky an ominous gray. The cabin itself was older than I expected. Its wooden exterior was worn, the paint peeling, and moss growing thick along the roof edges. I had seen pictures online, but nothing could prepare me for the silence that hung over the place. The forest felt alive, but in a quiet, watchful way, like it was observing me. I stepped out of the car and tried to stretch my stiff legs. The air smelled damp, mixed with pine and the faint scent of rot from the ground. I opened the cabin door, and the smell inside hit me immediately. Dust, mildew, and the faint tang of old wood. The interior was small and sparse. There was a tiny kitchen area with a rusted stove, a table with chipped paint, and a couple of rickety chairs. The living space had a worn couch and a small wood-burning stove. I set my backpack down and ran my fingers along the rough surfaces. Everything felt solid but fragile, like one wrong move could tear it apart. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, knowing that once darkness came, the isolation would feel complete. Night arrived quickly. The trees outside seemed darker than the cabin itself. The wind rustled through the branches, and the creaks and groans of the old cabin amplified each sound. I lit a small lamp, the light flickering weakly, barely pushing the shadows back. I tried to distract myself by organizing supplies and making a fire. The flames cast irregular shapes on the walls, stretching and collapsing as the wood crackled. I felt a small, creeping unease, the kind that makes your skin prickly, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It was just the first night, and the forest was a living thing, full of small noises, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. But it was also the silence between them that pressed against me. I had brought a small notebook and decided to write. Writing always calmed me. I recorded every sound I could hear, every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside. As the hours passed, I noticed a pattern to some of the sounds. There were definite footsteps in the underbrush, not from animals I could identify. They were deliberate, slow, sometimes stopping as if whoever or whatever was moving was observing me. I told myself it was the wind, branches falling, maybe a deer, but the feeling lingered, heavy in the pit of my stomach. The second night, the noises became more distinct. I woke several times, cold and uneasy, convinced I had heard voices. But when I opened my eyes, the cabin was empty, the wind the only sound moving through the trees. I checked the locks on the door and windows multiple times, though they all seemed intact. The forest outside was a solid wall of darkness. The feeling of being watched had intensified. I could sense shapes moving beyond the trees, something far enough to be just silhouettes, but close enough that I could feel their presence. I tried to stay calm, rationalizing everything in my mind, but it was hard. My senses had heightened. Every crackle of the fire seemed louder, every shadow sharper. Sleep came reluctantly, fragmented and shallow. By the third day, I realized I had underestimated the isolation. Food and water were fine, but the lack of human contact was wearing on me. I started walking outside during daylight, taking long routes through the forest, trying to map the terrain in my mind. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, mostly pines and spruce, with patches of moss and ferns covering the ground. Some areas were damp and muddy, while others were firm and dry. I noticed animal tracks, deer, rabbits, and one set that I couldn't immediately identify. They were larger than any normal forest animal in that region, with deep imprints and long stride patterns. My heart would pound every time I saw them, though I told myself it was probably a bear or a large wolf. That evening, as I returned to the cabin, I found a strange mark near the door. Not a scratch, not a paw print, but a series of deep, straight gouges in the wood, almost deliberate. I had left the cabin completely secure that morning. I checked the windows, locked. Nothing seemed out of place inside, but the marks on the outside shook me more than anything else had so far. I stayed near the fire that night, moving logs and keeping the flames high. Sleep was nearly impossible. My mind refused to quiet itself, going over every possibility. Wild animals, other humans, even the structural noises of the cabin. Each time the wind shifted, it sounded almost like breathing. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind. The fourth day, I decided to investigate. I took a long walk deeper into the forest, following a faint path that looked like it had been used years ago. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush was thicker. Branches snapped underfoot, and I constantly checked behind me. About 2 hours in, I came upon a small clearing. There was an old, abandoned hunting cabin. It looked decades old, its roof caved in and walls collapsing. But there were signs of recent activity. Footprints leading to and from it, a fire pit that had been used, and scattered pieces of food wrappers. Someone had been here recently. I felt a chill. I had assumed I was alone, but this confirmed that someone, or something, had been in the area. The tracks led off deeper into the forest. I debated whether to follow, but instinct told me to head back to my own cabin. Returning, I saw new marks, deeper and more numerous than the previous night. Someone had been circling the cabin. I felt a tight knot in my chest. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone knew I was here. I checked the perimeter meticulously and saw that some of the underbrush had been flattened deliberately. There were no signs of forced entry, but it was clear that whoever had done this was skilled at moving quietly. I realized with a sinking feeling that the isolation I had craved had made me vulnerable. There was no one to hear me if something went wrong. That night, I slept near the door, makeshift barricade in place. Every sound was amplified. The wind hitting the trees, the distant call of birds, the occasional snap of a branch. I convinced myself to stay calm, but every instinct screamed to leave. I checked my supplies, rationed food and water, and made a plan. If something happened, I needed to survive until morning. I thought through escape routes, considering the roads and the rough terrain I had driven through. The forest could be dangerous, but staying put might be worse. Early on the 5th day, I saw him, or rather, the evidence of him, again. A man, tall and thin, with dark clothing blending into the trees. He didn't approach the cabin directly, but stayed just out of sight, watching. I ducked behind the cabin, heart racing. He didn't move for hours. I waited until he left, slowly emerging, scanning the surrounding area. I realized I couldn't stay. The cabin was no longer safe. I packed quickly but carefully, grabbing only essentials and making sure the car was ready. I left the windows as they were, hoping to leave no trace behind. The drive out was tense. Every shadow on the road felt like someone standing there, every rustle in the trees a potential threat. I kept the windows up, doors locked, and speed low on the winding gravel roads. I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced I was being followed, but the forest remained empty. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the main road and then the town. The lights of civilization were like a bomb. I stopped at a small diner, shaky, cold, and exhausted. I drank coffee slowly, my hands trembling. I called the local sheriff and reported what I had seen and experienced. He listened, asked questions, and promised to send someone to check the area. In the following days, authorities investigated the forest around the cabin. They found evidence of someone living temporarily in hidden spots, making crude shelters, and moving silently. There were no injuries, no confrontations, but the marks on the cabin and the signs in the forest confirmed that someone had been stalking the area, likely using it for survival and hiding from authorities. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had survived, but the forest I thought would give me peace had instead tested me in ways I had never imagined. The experience left a lasting impression. I realized the world could be quiet and beautiful, but also unforgiving, full of dangers that moved silently, unseen and patient. The isolation I once craved now seemed reckless. I returned home with a new respect for nature and solitude and a renewed awareness of my own vulnerability. That cabin trip was supposed to be a retreat, a place of peace, but it became a test of awareness, patience, and survival. Even now, I sometimes think back to the forest, the quiet, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched, and I understand that the real fear is not in the dark, but in the knowledge that someone or something can exist there unseen, waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to escape the endless noise of the city and find some solitude in the mountains. The cabin I rented was far off the main roads, almost hidden at the edge of a dense forest, the kind of place that promised isolation, quiet, and the illusion of control. I drove in late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the tall pines, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. The air was sharp, the smell of wet earth and pine heavy in the breeze. I remember feeling a flutter of excitement mixed with a strange, faint unease that I brushed off as anticipation. The cabin itself was modest, made of weathered logs, with a tin roof and a small porch that creaked under my weight. It had a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. The electricity worked, though faintly, enough to power a few lights. I parked my car beside the cabin, carrying in a few supplies, food, and firewood stacked under a tarp outside. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stove, the crackle of the wood echoing strangely in the silent forest. The warmth and the smell of burning pine were comforting, and I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the cabin as the light outside dwindled. By nightfall, the forest had completely swallowed the area in darkness. I lit a few lanterns and positioned them around the cabin. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Every sound, the wind against the cabin, the rustling of leaves, a distant bird, seemed amplified in the silence. I kept reminding myself that I was alone and that the isolation was part of the charm. But there was something about the way the darkness pressed against the cabin that made me uneasy, something that made me check the locks on the doors twice. The first night passed without incident, though I had trouble sleeping. Every small noise startled me. from the wind shaking the tin roof to the branches scraping against the windows. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, but the sunlight spilling through the trees offered a brief sense of relief. I went for a short walk around the perimeter of the cabin, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night. The forest was beautiful, dense, and alive, but there was an oppressive silence beyond the rustling of the trees, an absence of human sound that made the solitude feel heavier. I spent the next day performing small chores, gathering firewood, cleaning the cabin, and organizing my supplies. The work was mundane but grounding. The forest was calm in the daylight, and I felt a little more at ease. That evening, I prepared a simple meal and sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames and the smell of the cooking food providing a comforting routine. As night fell, I made sure the doors and windows were secured. I had brought a small battery-powered radio, and it became my companion through the night, providing background noise to ward off the oppressive silence. The second night, however, the unease returned stronger than before. Around midnight, I was stirred awake by a sound outside the cabin. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the wind and the crackle of the dying fire. I froze, straining to listen. It was a soft scraping noise, like someone dragging something across the ground, but uneven, irregular. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate enough to feel unnerving. I got up cautiously, moving toward the window and peering into the darkness. The thick shadows between the trees made it impossible to see anything clearly, but the sound continued intermittently. I checked the doors again, double-locked them, and sat back down, trying to calm my racing mind. I told myself it was probably my imagination, the isolation and the darkness playing tricks. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening carefully, every small noise making me tense, every shadow in the corner of the room seeming like movement. By dawn, I was drained, my mind on edge, though the morning light brought some relief once again. The following day, I decided to explore the nearby area. I needed a distraction, something to take my mind off the fear that had settled over me. I packed some food and water and hiked along a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the quieter it became, until it felt like I was walking through a cathedral of trees. Sunlight pierced the canopy in beams, and the air smelled earthy and fresh. Yet there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. The forest seemed too still, the kind of stillness that made every snap of a twig feel loud and threatening. Around midday, I found a small clearing with a creek running through it. I sat by the water, letting it run over my hands, listening to the soft rush. I stayed there for an hour, trying to calm my mind, and eventually made my way back to the cabin. The sun was beginning to dip again, and as I walked, I noticed subtle changes in the forest. Branches that hadn't been there before seemed to block my path, and footprints in the mud suggested the presence of something, or someone, moving through the trees. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to wildlife, but unease gnawed at me. That night, I tried to sleep earlier, but the sense of being watched was nearly unbearable. Around 1 in the morning, the same scraping sound returned, louder this time, closer. My heart pounded as I moved to the window. Shadows flitted past, but I could see nothing clearly. I was alone, I reminded myself, and yet my mind wouldn't let go of the possibility that someone, or something, was out there. I retrieved the small hunting knife I had brought for emergencies, keeping it near me as I watched the darkness. Hours passed, each minute stretching painfully, until the first light of dawn began to seep through the cabin windows. I had not slept, my body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. I decided I couldn't stay another night like this. I needed a plan, a way to ensure I could protect myself if anyone approached the cabin again. I packed essentials, food, water, my knife, and a small flashlight, and began making my way to the car, intending to leave for the day and return only once I had regained a sense of safety. As I moved toward the car, I noticed clear signs that someone had been near the cabin. Footprints in the mud, broken twigs, and marks on the porch railing. My pulse surged, fear coiling tightly in my chest. I moved quickly but carefully, scanning the trees for any movement. My car was parked exactly where I had left it, thankfully untouched. I drove slowly along the dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the forest edges, half expecting to see someone following. I decided to go to the nearest small town, about 30 minutes away, to regroup and consider my next steps. Once there, I called the local ranger station, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. They advised me to return to the cabin only with backup or wait until daylight and a second person could accompany me. Relieved, I checked into a motel for the night, exhausted, shaking, but grateful to have a temporary safe space. The next day, I returned to the cabin with 2 rangers. They conducted a thorough search of the area, following the footprints and signs I had noticed. It turned out that a local man, a drifter who had been living off the land for weeks, had been nearby. He had been observing the cabin, curious about who was staying there, but he had not entered the building. The rangers spoke to him and ensured he was removed from the area, warning him about the dangers and the need to respect private property. Relief washed over me when the rangers confirmed there was no immediate threat remaining. I spent the next few days in the cabin with more caution, securing all entry points, keeping the fire going, and avoiding walking into the deeper forest alone. The nights were still tense, but knowing that the immediate danger had been addressed allowed me to slowly regain my composure. I focused on practical tasks: chopping firewood, cooking meals, cleaning the cabin, and maintaining a clear perimeter around it. The forest, once terrifying in its silence, began to feel manageable again, alive but not hostile. By the end of the week, I had managed to enjoy parts of the solitude I had initially sought. I walked during the day, observed wildlife, and even found a small grove where sunlight created a peaceful clearing. The fear that had gripped me initially did not disappear entirely, but it transformed into a cautious respect for the isolation and unpredictability of the wilderness. I returned to the city afterward, carrying the memory of the tension, the adrenaline, and the relief of survival. It had been a terrifying experience, but it had also taught me the importance of preparation, awareness, and respecting the limits of solitude in the wild. I still think about that cabin sometimes, the way the forest pressed in around it, the scraping sounds in the night, and the overwhelming silence. But I also remember the relief of seeing the rangers arrive, the clarity of daylight, and the sense of control I regained by taking practical steps to protect myself. That experience stayed with me, a vivid lesson in caution and resilience. It changed the way I approach solitude, wilderness, and the simple act of being alone, reminding me that the real fear is often not imaginary but grounded in real, tangible threats, and that careful action and awareness are the keys to overcoming it. I had been planning the trip for months, a week alone at a small, remote cabin tucked deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The place was off-grid, accessible only by a rough dirt road that twisted and climbed through dense pine forests. I wanted nothing more than isolation, fresh air, and a chance to disconnect from everything for a while. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built decades ago by a man who had wanted a retreat far from the world. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a loft bedroom that overlooked the main room. The walls were thick logs, and the windows were old but sealed tightly, which gave the cabin a certain comforting heaviness. The first day was uneventful. I spent it hiking the surrounding trails, noting the way the sunlight fell through the trees, listening to the wind whisper through the branches. Birds and squirrels moved quietly through the undergrowth, and the occasional distant sound of a deer stepping over fallen branches reminded me how alone I truly was. That evening, I made a fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and settled in to read, the warmth and crackle of the fire feeling like the only real companion I had. The second day, I ventured farther along a trail I hadn't seen before. It was narrower and less worn, overgrown in places with ferns and wildflowers, and the forest grew darker and denser the further I went. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I had intended. My sense of direction was poor, and the trail seemed to loop and twist back on itself, unfamiliar even though I had memorized the map the night before. I decided to turn back, but as I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the dirt that weren't mine. They were large, heavy prints like work boots, and they weren't quite the right size or shape for a deer or any animal I knew. They followed the trail I had come from, but I hadn't seen anyone else all day. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a ranger, a hiker, or a hunter who had passed earlier. But as the sun dipped lower, the woods grew eerily silent. Birds stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to die down. I felt exposed, every shadow more distinct, every tree more menacing. The footprints seemed to branch off from the trail, heading deeper into the forest. I felt my heart rate quicken and decided to hurry back. Returning to the cabin, I locked the door and bolted the windows, though there was no real lock except for the simple sliding bolts. I unpacked the small stove, made some tea, and tried to calm myself. It was impossible not to notice the way the darkness seemed to press against the windows, the way the forest just beyond the cabin edge felt alive and waiting. I slept poorly that night, waking every hour to small noises, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant echo of something moving through the trees. The third day, I went into town briefly to gather supplies. When I returned, I noticed something I had not before. The cabin's front step had scuff marks, as if someone had dragged boots across the wood. Inside, nothing seemed taken or disturbed, but a sense of unease had settled into my chest, a tension I could not shake. That night, I decided to double-check the cabin's security. I moved furniture in front of the door, reinforced the windows with spare boards, and made sure my only phone, which had weak service, was fully charged. The fourth day was quiet during the day, which felt both a relief and an ominous sign. I spent the morning chopping firewood, stacking it neatly, and making sure I had enough to last the week. By afternoon, dark clouds had gathered, and a chill crept through the air. The forest seemed to grow silent again, heavier this time, like it was holding its breath. As evening fell, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. More footprints outside, circling the cabin. These were fresh, and they didn't resemble any animal I knew. They were large, human, and purposeful. I stayed inside that night, the only light coming from the fire. I moved silently from window to window, peering out into the blackness. Every so often, I thought I saw movement. A shadow darting behind a tree, the flash of a boot in the corner of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone. My mind raced, imagining the worst. Someone had followed me here. I had thought I was prepared for solitude, but I was not prepared for being watched. By the fifth day, I had begun to notice patterns. The footprints were always there in the morning, as if someone had circled the cabin overnight. I could hear small things shifting outside, the crunch of leaves, the occasional metallic clink. Once, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the edge of the tree line, standing still, watching. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for movement, but it never came. I realized I had to make a plan. I couldn't stay passive. The cabin was isolated, my only access to help a weak phone signal. I gathered every tool I had. The axe I had brought for wood, a hunting knife, and a flare I had bought at the store just in case. I reinforced the doors and windows as best I could, creating barricades that might slow someone down. I felt absurd, like I was preparing for a siege in a place that should have been peaceful. That night, I slept in the loft, the axe within reach, the knife on the pillow beside me. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone trying the front door. Heavy thuds, testing, the scrape of boots across wood. My heart slammed. I could hear breathing outside, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting. They didn't break in, but they left marks, deep scratches across the wood. My body trembled with adrenaline. The next morning, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave, but the dirt road was narrow and long, and the footprints suggested someone was following me even if I tried to drive away. I packed as quickly as possible, gathering all my essentials and leaving the cabin mostly intact to avoid confrontation. I waited until daylight, then ran to my car, keys in hand, heart racing, eyes scanning the trees constantly. I drove slowly at first, listening for sounds behind me. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every turn, every bend in the road, I imagined someone stepping out of the trees. I reached the paved highway, finally breathing easier, and made my way to the nearest town. I stopped at a gas station, called the sheriff, and reported what had happened. They took notes, asked questions, but there was nothing they could do immediately. The officer said someone might have been following hikers or scouting cabins in the area, perhaps for theft or worse. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with law enforcement. They scoured the woods, found more footprints, and eventually discovered hidden campsites nearby where someone had been living off-grid and watching the cabin for days. No one confronted me directly, but the realization that someone had been stalking the cabin, observing every movement, filled me with unease. The authorities recommended the cabin be sold or permanently vacated. I followed their advice. In the end, I learned several things from that trip. First, isolation can be beautiful, but it is vulnerable. The woods are indifferent, and humans are unpredictable. Second, preparation matters not just for survival against nature, but against other people. I had the tools, the awareness, and the patience, and they kept me safe. And finally, I understood that fear is manageable when approached with careful attention, clear thinking, and caution. I left the cabin behind, but the lessons stayed with me. The woods remained as beautiful as I remembered, but they would never feel entirely safe again. I returned to civilization with a stronger sense of self, a better understanding of vigilance, and the knowledge that survival sometimes depends on quiet endurance, not heroics. I had been planning the trip for months, poring over maps and marking remote trails that were barely used anymore. My idea was simple. I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city, from the unending pressure of work, from the incessant stream of people and their expectations. I found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep into the forest, miles from the nearest road, with no neighbors within walking distance. The photos were basic, nothing fancy. Wooden, weathered, a little crooked, but it looked solid. The description promised solitude, which I desperately craved. I arrived in late autumn, when the forest was transitioning from the heat of summer to the chill of winter. The air was crisp, carrying a faint smell of wet leaves and pine. The drive up the narrow dirt road was longer than I expected. I had to stop a few times to check the map because the road seemed to twist back on itself, snaking between thick trees that leaned over the path like they were watching me. There was no cell phone signal for most of the drive, and even the GPS faltered. At one point, I realized I had passed a small fallen tree that blocked the road slightly and had to reverse several hundred feet to navigate around it. My hands were tense on the steering wheel, the car rattling over roots and stones. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, maybe 2 rooms with a loft above. The wood was old, darkened by years of weather. Moss crept up the sides of the walls. The windows were dusty but intact, and the door had a simple latch that worked smoothly. There was a small stack of firewood near the entrance, already partially covered with a thin layer of frost. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because I had finally arrived, unease because the silence was heavier than I anticipated, almost tangible. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. Dust coated the corners, and cobwebs hung like delicate curtains from the ceiling beams. There was a small stove in the corner, a rough wooden table, and a single bed with a threadbare mattress. A metal basin sat near the stove, likely for washing. I unpacked my supplies, organizing my food, water, and gear, feeling the isolation sink in further with every movement. The sun disappeared entirely while I worked, leaving the cabin in dim twilight. That first night, I tried to make a fire. I had brought matches, kindling, and logs, but the wood outside was damp, and lighting it took longer than expected. Eventually, the flames took hold, and the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of burning pine. I ate a simple meal, bread and canned beans, staring into the fire and listening. At first, the silence was comforting. Then, I started to notice little things, the creaks of the cabin settling, the scratching of small animals outside. Every few minutes, the wind would push against the walls, groaning softly. I tried to convince myself it was all normal, that old wood makes noises. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was not completely alone. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The forest was dense, a mix of evergreens and leafless deciduous trees. The ground was covered with a thick layer of leaves, some wet and rotting, some crisp and brittle. I found a small stream nearby, its water cold and clear, running over smooth stones. It felt good to see water, to know I had a source close by. I walked further, noticing the signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, and occasional scat. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I had intended to go further into the woods, but the thought of losing sight of the cabin made me uneasy, so I turned back. The second night, I slept lightly. I woke multiple times to strange noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant sound of water, maybe the stream or maybe something else. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across the window, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. I kept the fire low, just enough to give off warmth without drawing too much attention. My mind tried to rationalize everything. Deer, foxes, maybe a raccoon. But even with rational explanations, unease had settled into my chest. On the third day, I decided to gather more firewood. I had underestimated the cold, and I needed a reliable supply. I grabbed my axe and walked into the forest, marking my path carefully so I could find my way back. The trees towered over me, their branches bare or turning brittle with frost. I cut several logs, stacking them in a neat pile near the cabin. As I worked, I kept hearing noises, a distant snapping, like a branch breaking, then nothing. I told myself it was probably the wind. Still, a nervous tension clung to me, making me jump at every sound. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. The fire was small, just enough to keep the cabin from feeling unbearably cold. I lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard something distinct. A footstep, light but deliberate, outside the cabin. My stomach tightened. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I stayed still, straining to hear. After several minutes, silence returned. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer stepping on a fallen branch. But the rhythm didn't match. It was deliberate, not random. I didn't sleep well after that. Every creak, every groan of the cabin made me alert. I lay there, imagining scenarios I didn't want to think about. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted in and out of sleep, always with a sense of being watched. The following day, I tried to distract myself. I walked along the stream, examined the rocks, and even found a small clearing where I could sit and observe birds. But as I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The pile of firewood I had stacked was disturbed. Logs were shifted, some lying across the others. I had double-checked it before I left. The thought that someone, or something, had moved the wood while I was gone filled me with a tense panic. I searched around the perimeter, walking slowly, scanning the trees and shadows, but I found no one. There were no footprints I could identify, no signs of a human presence. That night, I decided to secure the cabin better. I moved furniture in front of the door, pushed a chair under the latch, and even wedged a stick against the window. I sat in the corner with a small flashlight, staring at the walls, listening for any sound. Hours passed. Occasionally, I heard the softest footsteps outside, just enough to make my heart leap. I didn't try to look out. I didn't want to see. By the fourth day, I was exhausted, running low on mental energy. The isolation and the constant tension were wearing me down. I had no way to call for help, no one to talk to, and my mind kept going over the events of the last nights. I was certain that someone had been near the cabin, watching or moving around, but there was no trace of them. Food was running low. My nerves were frayed. Every shadow looked like a person, every sound a threat. On the fifth day, I decided to take a longer walk, farther from the cabin than I had before. I knew I needed to understand the area better. I brought my backpack with water, a small first aid kit, and my knife. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the sounds of the forest, the stream, and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I walked for hours, noting landmarks and trying to keep a sense of direction. Eventually, I reached a rocky ridge that overlooked the forest below. The view was stunning. The trees stretched endlessly, a tapestry of yellows, browns, and greens. It was peaceful, and for a moment, I felt the tension leave my shoulders. As I started heading back, I realized that the path I had taken didn't match the landmarks I had noted. The forest seemed denser, the shadows deeper. Panic began to creep in. I retraced my steps, trying to find familiar markers, but everything looked slightly different, as though the forest had shifted. I began to run, moving as quickly as I could while avoiding low branches and roots. The sun was starting to drop, and I knew I needed to return to the cabin before darkness fully fell. I heard the footsteps again, close this time, breaking the leaves behind me. I stopped, frozen, listening. They weren't animal footsteps. They were deliberate, human, slow. I gripped my knife tightly and tried to make myself as small and quiet as possible. Then I heard a branch snap to my right. I ran without thinking, branches whipping my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Eventually, I saw the cabin in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the fact that someone, or something, had been following me. I reached the cabin, slammed the door, pushed furniture against it again, and bolted the latch. I could hear movement outside, but the person didn't stay long. Hours passed, the sounds finally fading. That night, I made a plan. I had supplies in the car, parked a few miles down the road. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. Couldn't. The isolation had been a challenge, but the possibility of someone lurking outside, watching, had broken something in me. At first light, I packed everything into my backpack, double-checked the cabin, and left quietly. The walk back to the road felt endless. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. Every snap of a branch made me jump. When I finally reached the car, my hands shook so badly I could barely open the door. I drove away slowly, eyes scanning the edges of the forest, every sense alert. I didn't look back until I reached a small town miles down the road. Only then did the tension begin to leave my body. I never returned to that cabin. I learned later that the area had reports of poachers and trespassers. It made sense now. The signs I had noticed, the disturbed firewood, the footsteps at night. I had been lucky to leave when I did. That trip had been meant to be an escape, a peaceful retreat into nature. Instead, it became a lesson in vigilance and the reality that isolation in the wrong place can be dangerous. The forest is beautiful, but it is also indifferent, and there are people in the world who will exploit the solitude of others. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the cabin in that forest, the way the shadows moved across the walls, the sound of footsteps just outside. I can still feel the cold fear creeping up my spine, the tight knot in my stomach as I realized how vulnerable I had been. It was a terrifying experience, but it ended with me alive, aware, and deeply changed. I have never underestimated isolation since, and I make sure I am never completely alone or unprepared, no matter how tempting the promise of solitude may be. I had been looking forward to the trip for months, counting down the days, imagining the quiet, the peace, the escape from the city's constant noise and the ceaseless pressure of work. I had chosen a cabin deep in the woods, far from any towns or main roads. The listing promised isolation, a small stream nearby, and a dense forest that could swallow sound itself. I wanted nothing but to hike, to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and to feel removed from the world. I didn't want distractions. I wanted silence. The drive out of the city was long and monotonous at first, but gradually the streets gave way to country roads, lined with fields and occasional clusters of trees. The sun was high when I finally left the last paved road and took a dirt track that led further into the forest. Dust rose under my tires and settled in streaks on the windshield. The map on my phone showed no nearby towns, only winding roads through dense green that stretched for miles. My phone service had already dropped to 0 bars, a small warning I ignored, thinking I had brought enough supplies to be entirely self-reliant. The cabin itself was small, made of dark timber that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding trees. A narrow trail led to it, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the smell of the forest, damp and earthy, with faint hints of decaying leaves. The air was thick but fresh, heavy with moisture. Birds chirped intermittently, but there was a strange emptiness to the sound, as if even they were cautious about how far they ventured. The interior of the cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a bed tucked into a corner. A few shelves held old cookbooks and some dusty jars of preserved food. I unpacked slowly, methodically, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as I realized I wouldn't have to deal with anyone for days. There was no electricity except for a single lantern, which I placed on a table in the center of the room. I had brought a backpack of supplies, enough for hiking, and a small bag with food and water for the first few days. The plan was simple: hike during the day, return before dark, sleep, and repeat. The first night was quiet, but it carried a subtle tension. The sounds of the forest seemed sharper in the darkness. I could hear twigs snapping, distant rustlings, and the occasional flutter of wings. The cabin itself was drafty, and the wind outside made the walls creak. I laid awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that these were ordinary noises. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I set out early. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but manageable. Moss covered the rocks, and the occasional fallen log forced me to step carefully. I kept a map in hand and a compass, though I knew instinctively which direction I needed to go. The forest was alive with movement. Squirrels darting across the trail, birds flitting between branches, insects buzzing, but everything seemed deliberate and watchful. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. By mid-morning, I had reached a small clearing near a stream. The water was crystal clear, running over smooth stones, reflecting the sunlight in flickering patterns. I knelt by the edge and took a drink, feeling the cold shock of it wake every nerve. I decided to rest for a while, taking in the forest in a way I hadn't before. It was beautiful, almost unnervingly so. There was a perfection to it that made me uneasy. No broken branches, no litter, nothing out of place, nothing to hint that humans ever came here. Felt ancient. I returned to the cabin that evening, tired but satisfied. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the trail, and I had to step carefully as darkness approached. The first time I used the lantern in the cabin, it flickered oddly, and for a moment I thought it was my imagination, but it stabilized after a few seconds. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, sitting close to the light, aware of the forest pressing against the windows. I could hear more sounds now, closer than before. Rustling, thuds, faint scraping noises. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons, moving near the cabin. I had read enough survival guides to know that forests were full of life after dark. That night, sleep was harder. The sounds were louder, more insistent. Twigs snapped near the cabin, as if someone, or something, were circling it. I lay awake, straining my ears. Then came the first unmistakable sound. A slow, deliberate knocking on the cabin wall. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a branch or some loose panel. It came again, the sharp thump echoing through the wooden structure. My heart pounded. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped toward the door, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows, trees swaying in the wind. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Every rustle outside made me tense. When morning came, I was exhausted, my nerves raw. I considered leaving immediately, but I had driven hours to get here and I didn't want to admit defeat. I told myself that today I would stay closer to the cabin, stick to known trails, and keep my wits about me. The day passed without incident, though the tension never left. I noticed subtle signs that something had been near the cabin. Footprints in the mud, branches broken unnaturally, small scratches on the wooden porch railing. They were faint, easy to dismiss, but they were there. I tried to focus on hiking, observing the forest, taking photos, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. On the third night, things escalated. I had just finished eating when I heard the sounds again. The slow, rhythmic thumping, circling the cabin. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and my small hatchet, creeping to the door. The porch was empty. I scanned the surrounding trees with the light, but all I saw were trunks, leaves, and shadows. Yet the sounds continued, now accompanied by faint scraping, like someone dragging something across the ground. Panic began to rise, sharp and cold. I locked the door and bolted the windows, though I knew they were flimsy. The forest outside felt alive, not with animals but with intent. I spent hours crouched near the stove, flashlight in hand, listening. The sounds eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I slept fitfully that night, waking every time a branch snapped. By morning, I was exhausted, hungry, and on edge. I decided I needed to investigate, but cautiously. I packed some supplies, keeping my phone and a small flare gun handy, and left the cabin. The trail behind the cabin led to a deeper part of the woods. I followed it, examining the ground carefully. Soon I found what had been causing the noises. A man, disheveled and gaunt, had clearly been living in the woods. There were signs of a makeshift camp near the cabin, a few blankets, and evidence of someone scavenging for food. I realized with a jolt that the noises had been deliberate. He had been watching me, testing me, trying to intimidate me. My heart raced. I knew now that I was not alone, and I was vulnerable. I retreated back to the cabin quickly, barricading the door and windows. I called the police, though my phone had no signal. I tried again, and after an hour of pacing, a single bar appeared. I managed to send a message, my hands shaking, hoping they would respond. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything into my car, ready to leave the moment help arrived. By mid-afternoon, the police were on site. They found tracks and signs of the man's presence, and a search was begun. I watched from the safety of the car as they combed the area. The feeling of being watched lifted gradually, though I could not forget it. I had been naive to think the forest was safe. Isolation can be deadly, especially when there are other humans willing to exploit it. In the end, the man was found a few miles away, disoriented but not violent. He had been living off the land, surviving in the forest for weeks. He was arrested and the area was secured. I returned to the city shaken but relieved. The experience had left a mark, a reminder that the world is full of unknowns, and that danger often comes not from the forest or nature, but from other people. I never returned to that cabin, but I kept the photos I had taken, both as a memory of the beauty and as a reminder of how quickly calm can turn to fear when reality is closer than it seems. The trip that was supposed to be a peaceful retreat became a lesson in vigilance and respect. I understood now that isolation magnifies everything: the smallest sound, the faintest movement, the subtle signs that someone is there. And I learned that fear is real, tangible, and sometimes human. The woods were still beautiful, but I never forgot the cold weight of being watched, the slow pounding on the cabin walls, and the realization that safety is never guaranteed, even in the quietest places.